Did you know that despite having consulted as many South African wine historians as I could possibly get my hands on, I am still no closer to figuring out exactly how Cabernet Sauvignon actually arrived in South Africa. Of course, there are various milestones that we can reference along the way. So we know that in 1973, the South African Wine of Origin labeling system came into being, and in that year, Stellenbosch giants Kanonkop bottled their first Cabernet Sauvignon, along with a whole bunch of other guys. Although it should be noted that in 1973, the original stipulation said that you really only needed 30% Cabernet in the bottle in order to use Cabernet on the label. Thankfully, it's gotten a little more stringent since then. But we can actually go further back than 1973 because we know that labels like Zonneblom and Alto and Nederburg were making Cabernet, or at least Cabernet-ish wines as far back as the mid-60s. Historian Joanne Gibson says that Alto had their first Cabernet vintage in 1965, and the oldest image that Nederburg have of one of their Cabernets comes from 1966. But we can actually go even further back than that, because in 1926, Professor Abraham Paarl, who of course was the father of Pinotage, wrote in his book about winemaking and viniculture that Cabernet was a very, very important grape that would help to improve the quality of wines coming out of the Cape Winelands. He also acknowledged at the time, though, that Cabernet had very low yields compared to a kind of monster yielder like Cinsault. But he went on to say that despite the poor short-term economic picture that Cabernet painted, he was convinced that wine farmers and winemakers would regret not planting Cabernet in order to have the kind of richer, bigger, darker Cabernet juice in their wines. And because we know that Paarl was a cautious and rigorous scientist, he wouldn't have written something like that unless he'd already been observing Cabernet for some time. So we can deduce that at least by 1926, the proliferation of Cabernet was already a thing. But we can go even further back. And thanks to an article by historian Tim James, which is absolutely fantastic, and I'll leave a link to that, we know that Cabernet Sauvignon was already in the ground in Groot Constantia by 1888 or 1889, because there was a parliamentary report that already talked about extensive Cabernet plantings at Groot Constantia. We also know, thanks to another historian, that there is a photo of a bottle of Cabernet de Sauvignon from Groot Constantia with the vintage 1903 on it. Tim James points out that probably there were earlier vintages than that, but that's the first one we have evidence of. And given the state of the wine world at the time, this could easily be one of the first cultivar bottlings of Cabernet in the world. Now, the reason that we're pondering Cabernet at all is because today's hand drink solo wine of the day is the Ridgeback Cabernet Sauvignon 2018, made by winemaker Toy Vessels, using fruit from Ridgeback Estate, which is located in the Paarl wine district. Ridgeback are probably best known for their Cabernet Francs and their rather rich and aromatic Viogniers, but when I tasted their Cabernet Sauvignon 2018, I thought it was too good not to include. And for those of you who like to keep an eye on the future, I think their 2019 vintage, which will be released in 2024, is going to be even better. Paarl, as a district, has for a long time been seen as the kind of dopey, thick-set country bumpkin sibling to the slightly more debonair and charismatic district of Stellenbosch. If we were to completely banish charity, I think it would be fair to compare Paarl perhaps to Hodor from Game of Thrones. Thick-set, bulky and dependable, but certainly not a poster child. However, things are slowly starting to change for this really rather warm, marginally continental wine district. Mostly because their more savvy producers are really beginning to understand what Paarl is really good at. And in my mind, what Paarl is really good at is making big, rich, ripe, structured wines that, when made by the right winemakers who choose the right cultivars, can deliver some absolutely world-class wines within the big blockbuster genre. Of late, this has proven to be true, not least of all because a brand like Villafonte, which is one of South Africa's uber premium red wine brands, gets awarded both Outstanding Producer and Best Red Wine Producer in the world by the IWSC. Many people make the mistake of thinking that Villafonte is a Stellenbosch brand because their cellar is in Stellenbosch, but their vineyards are 100% in the Paarl district. Adding to this Paarl momentum is the fact that the Platter 2024 Wine Guide had its highest scoring Shiraz blend also coming from Paarl, which was the Fairview Cyrilback 2020 Red Blend. Now, of course, these don't prove that everything coming from Paarl is good, but what it does prove is that Paarl is capable of making some of the best wines in the country, if not in the New World. But I've once again made the mistake of pontificating about what everyone else thinks, when perhaps what is more important, or at least more relevant, is the wine that is in the glass in front of you. So when we do get into the glass and take a sniff, well, the first impression one gets really is quite brooding and serious. There are these waves of rich, ripe, blackcurrant fruit, and these are offset ever so slightly by lighter, fresher black cherry. But then you dive back into the savory, moody elements of roasted plum skins. But then that in turn is also lightened ever so slightly with a sort of garnish of sweeter star anise and clove spice. So it really is quite a dynamic nose, but the overall impression is one of richness and ripeness. Now, when we take a sip, well, the overwhelming concentration up front really shouldn't surprise you. First of all, because what we just learnt about the Paarl district, but second of all, because of what we smelt on the nose. You have really concentrated, rich, dark, ripe fruit. But this in turn leans up against some slightly brighter blackberry juicy acidity that I wouldn't have expected from the nose. But just because it's rich and ripe and a little bit velvety doesn't mean that it's soft. The tannins on this wine really are still big and quite firm. But in the context of all the waves of black fruit, the balance between tannin and fruit really is quite tidy. And then as you go into the finish, it's actually superbly savory at the end. And those roasted plum notes come out, and then there's some sweet sort of tobacco leaf that goes along with it, and those linger really pleasantly until the lights go out. Okay, so that's all we have time for today. But if you have any questions about Paarl or the history of Cabernet in South Africa, or some corrections about anything I've said to do with the history of Cabernet in South Africa, then leave a comment on the website and I will get back to you as soon as I possibly can. And if you enjoyed the video, then support us on Patreon to help us make more of these videos, and subscribe to the Hand Drink Solo YouTube channel, where we publish at least 6 videos every single month on things like wine science, wine history, unusual cultivars, and some of the rising winemaking stars that are coming out of the dynamic South African winelands.